Welcome to the 2020 Inclusive Education Expo, which is online this year. My name is Ian May, Director of Disability Policy and Programs, and on behalf of all the organisers, welcome you and hope this aids in your understanding of inclusion and the journey towards it. Acknowledge Kaurna land and the importance of it, and the videotaping is on Kaurna land. But know that not all of you may be on Kaurna land, so wherever you are, acknowledge the Aboriginal lands. This year is online. We have 25 other presentations from a rich, diverse range of backgrounds of the people. Educators, researchers, parents and students. And each have got thoughts about inclusion and a journey towards it. I'm looking forward to hearing about some of those. But as an opening address, perhaps the best way is to start with you. What do you think about inclusion? What do you believe? What's your understanding of it? Perhaps write it down. And by writing it down, you might reflect on it later as you listen to some of the presentations. Perhaps as you've written down your thoughts, you've focused on students with disability. And perhaps not. Inclusion is about all. I'd like to go forward now and listen to some thinking from Elizabeth Dickinson, who's a Senior Policy Officer in Inclusion in our Department of Education. And with her, look at the principles of inclusion.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the question. And I think it's a question that we're actually exploring together throughout the Expo, like what is inclusion and what is inclusive education? It's a question that's complex and it's challenging and the answer is collaborative, but I would like to share some ideas with everybody. Recently Linda Graham said that it's important if we're going to do inclusive education well that an educative community really understands in a shared way the philosophies, the concepts, the languages and the practices that underpin inclusion. And so through the Expo, I'm sure all of those particular aspects are going to be explored. And I'd like to just share 4 ideas in this short time with everybody today. So firstly, what's the philosophy that sits underneath inclusive education and how can understanding of ontology help? What do we share in our understandings of segregation, exclusion, integration and inclusion? And where does equity, a shared understanding of equity, help us to think about practice and the theory that underpins inclusive education? So ontology is a really big word and I hope to break it down really well in this conversation. Ontology's etymology is from the word ontos. It's a Greek word and it means being. And obviously logic is thinking. So it's thinking about what it is to be a being, what it is to be a human being. And when a collective such as ourselves, an education community, ask ourselves that question, we're really asking ourselves, what do we share in our understanding of what it is to be human? What is it to be a human being? And this question sits really well with the human rights model of disability that's starting to emerge. It's starting to pose the question about what do we believe about what it is to be human, and coming down when we think about education as a human right and the acknowledgement that all people have dignity, that all human people are creative, all people are imaginative, all people have agency in their life, they are reflective, they search for meaning and purpose, they're relational, they're reciprocal. These are the things that make all people human. So something that occurred to me recently, and I've been sharing with people when I've been thinking through what is inclusion, it's a recognition that, well, I am the same as you. I'm a human person, but I'm also different. And my differences is something that I share in common with you. So also when we think about inclusion in that way, our differences are our commonality. So that brings us to those words that are a part of our lexicon as educators, that we know are historical words. They're words that we keep searching for the meaning of and collectively search for the meaning of. And so that's exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion. So with a shared understanding of the human person and the understanding that there are no exceptions, that leads us this understanding that, well, there is no place for exclusion. We are, just by being human, a collective. No one is left out of being human, so no one should be left out of society, no one should be left out of the entitlement of education. A genuinely inclusive education system recognises that essentially, despite our differences, we're the same, without exception. So if we believe without exception, then we believe without exclusion. That leads us then to a consideration of segregation. It's interesting that as a teacher, I've seen these ideas played out in the landscape of my own professional life. I remember the first school that I taught at, and I can honestly say that we didn't have one student enrolled in the school with a disability. And at the time, it didn't occur to me to challenge that. But now I realise that what was happening is that young people who were entitled to the education that was happening in that place were simply segregated. They were essentially excluded, but they were being offered education somewhere other than that place. So yes, people would say education was being provided, there was an opportunity to be educated, but there wasn't an invitation to be educated in that particular place, but rather segregated, apart from, in a different place. So in my naivety, I didn't question that really. And then I moved to other settings, and like many other educators, began to hear the word in the mid-90s of integration. Okay, we're going to integrate our children and young people with disability. Well, we'd use words like into the mainstream, so into the normal. So we'd invite people in without recognising their difference and encourage them to fit in. It reminds me of a chorus from a Missy Higgins song, many of you might know it. It was a triangle trying to squeeze through a circle. They tried to cut me so I'd fit. It's trying to make me the same, make me fit in, provide me with opportunities to be like everybody else and successful in the same place, in the same way as everybody else. And I know that I struggled with that idea philosophically, and I struggled with it as a practitioner. So there was definitely a call to include children and young people with disability. But the notion of integration was asking them to allow us to set aside their difference and find ways for them to belong to the mainstream, to the collective, to the norm, assuming that there was a norm. And so now Ian's asking the question, what is inclusion? Well, inclusion isn't exclusion. Inclusion isn't segregation. And we're beginning to recognise that inclusion isn't integration. Inclusion is much more challenging. Inclusion is how do we create spaces that recognise the deep value of every human person as they come to that place? And how do we create spaces where everybody enjoys the entitlement of access and participation and thriving and flourishing to reach their potentiality? And how do we understand that if we get inclusion right in our school spaces, if all children and young people genuinely have access and participation, including children with disabilities, then we know that we're also giving them access and participation to employment and education beyond school and to agency in their adult lives. So for me, that's what inclusive schools look like. And so if we think about schools, inclusive schools, as spaces where everyone gets the opportunity to thrive and flourish into themselves, then we have to recognise that for all of us, we need different opportunities, different experiences in those places to come to have those experiences of thriving and flourishing. And in thinking through what I would speak about today, I thought there's two models that seem to work really well together in explaining how that is possible. The first is the human rights model of disability, understanding the absolute value of every human person and therefore their entitlement to education. And then we have the social model of disability, which really challenges all of us in our spaces to ask, what are the barriers that disable people from success, from access, from participation, from being included? And this is my final idea, the idea of equity. Inclusive schools are equitable spaces. They're places that look at every individual circumstance and notice and care about what barriers those individuals confront. They can be physical barriers. Perhaps the things that we notice the most are the physical barriers. There can be barriers to communication and to relationships. So inclusive education spaces, inclusive educators ask the question, how do we take actions of equity that remove the barriers for all of us and for every child and for every young person so that they have complete access and participation in their lives at school? So Ian, you asked me a big question. What is inclusion? They're just some ideas about what inclusion is. And I know that the rest of the Expo will continue to tease out these questions together. And so I hope everybody enjoys the Expo. Thank you.
Following on, for me, inclusion is a place and a process. Both need to be considered. The place, the environment, the structures, how we group children and students together, and the process, the cycle of learning, the curriculum, the pedagogy, the assessment and reporting, and the consultation with the child and the student and their families around how we construct and personalise the learning. Both need to be considered. If one isn't, then I think we have an imbalance of our thinking around inclusion. The inclusion journey has been happening for quite a while, and it will be continuing to do so. It will continue because teachers want the best for students. We want to look at the best ways of including students and achieving and having high expectation and involving students in a personalised curriculum that makes a pathway for their future. We're learning a lot about inclusion. There is more and more research that guides and informs our work. We have some schools and teachers that are leading inclusion and we're learning from them. And so there's a cross-pollinisation of our thinking, that networking and that sharing. And it will be a journey because we're committed to this as a society and as Australia. We've signed up to some international agreements around inclusion. And with that, there's some examination of our practices. We have the Royal Commission into Disability happening in Australia. And that light on inclusion is being examined. There's an issues paper that's online that people can have a look at now and make comment on, and it makes us think about inclusion. So it's going to be a journey. We're always going to be trying to make it better for our students. As we go ahead with this journey, it's also interesting to see what's happening elsewhere. So overseas, there has been different journeys. This is an opportunity now to hear from Kendra Cox, who is a psychologist in the Port Lincoln Education Office. She's participated in a study fellowship and visited some overseas countries and looked at their inclusive practices.
Hi, I'm Kendra. I'm a psychologist at the Port Lincoln Education Office. I've been in that role for the past 5.5 years now, and before that I was working in disability research and at the local special school as well. I've been asked to talk about my exciting opportunity with Churchill Fellowship last year. So the idea came to me after reading about a few articles about the Italian school system. So Italy is considered to have some of the most progressive and inclusive educational policies around supporting students with disability and neurodiversity. So over there, for the past 50 years, it's been part of their policy to include all students in all lessons. And as I was reflecting on these articles, it really made me think, what exactly are they doing and how do they make it work? What does work? What doesn't work? And what can we learn from them? What lessons can they pass on after their 50 years in the field? With this in mind, I applied for a Churchill Fellowship. Churchill Fellowships are designed to offer Australians the opportunity to travel overseas to investigate a topic or an issue that they're passionate about. It's for people who, after working in the space and looking into what's happening within Australia, now want to see what other countries are doing in a similar space to inspire new ideas and innovation. I put in a proposal to spend 8 weeks visiting Italy, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Sweden and Norway. And luckily that was successful, so I travelled at the end of last year. While I was away, I visited universities, schools, preschools and early intervention centres, and I met with teachers, students, parents and with researchers and theorists in the field as well. So I think I got a really good balance of what the research says, what the main theories are, alongside what does it actually look like in practice. I was looking at 2 levels. So on one hand, what's happening at a systems and a policy level in these settings, and then also what's happening at grassroots, on the ground. What does it look like in practice? What works and what doesn't work? Countries that I visited that did have inclusive education policies, these policies were really driven from a human rights perspective, and most of the changes came out of a United Nations agreement called the Salamanca Statement, which you can look into. The statement's available online if you're interested. The countries overall had a really big focus on the long-term goal of an inclusive society. So across visits, time and time again, the principals would say to me, we have inclusive schools so that we create inclusive societies. During the visit, I saw a range of education settings and practices. So some were quite similar to our own. Some had some flexible, different settings and programs that they offered. Some settings, students were fully included full-time, and others had a mix of programs that they could offer. Based on the fellowship, so what did I learn over 8 weeks, summarised in a tidy minute or two? Well, I spent a lot of time unpacking what inclusion is, what inclusion isn't, and have really come to the conclusion that it's really important for us to think of inclusion as a value that we can continue working towards rather than a final state to achieve. So rather than thinking, what's the one change that we could make to make us an inclusive education system, we instead can think with every decision and with every action, is this a move towards inclusion or a move away from inclusion? And from this, to extend even further, what are some moves that we can make that would continue to make us more inclusive and more inclusive as a system? The bottom line is, for our students, it has to be successful for them, and if it's not successful, then we can't call it inclusion. The schools that I visited that had been working on this in this area for decades and decades still said every year they'll review their policies, they'll review their practices and make changes to be more inclusive and more inclusive. And I think it's that spirit of continual learning and continual motivation towards positive change that we can really learn from. When I think of the standout kind of successes and things that were really, really great that were happening across these countries, so every school that I visited, there were some really wonderful examples of students with disability and neurodiversity learning alongside other students their age. Above all, there were some great examples of leadership and teachers thinking really flexibly and really creatively to ensure that every student in their class could meaningfully contribute to the lesson and to the school community in a number of ways. Something that a lot of schools did really well was the whole school approaches to support students across a range of areas of need. And they often spoke about this idea of the magic formula, as one principal put it, which is basically just that understanding that students learn best from each other as well. So our students with disability in these settings were accessing some really wonderful peer role modelling. And students without disability, whenever I'd interview them time and time again, the thing that they'd say is that having students with a variety of needs in their class helped them to develop into the best people that they could be. So learning how they could communicate with someone who is non-speaking, or them being able to tap into new areas of strength and interest, and learning from every single other student and really being open to diversity. Students, schools that I visited also had some excellent vocational programs in secondary school, and these programs were targeted to meet every student where they were at and build upon their own personal strengths and their interest. And they often pulled in a lot of assistive technology tools to help build independence in this area as well. Thinking again, long term, what skills can we give these students to support them once they've graduated from school? At the other end, I spent some time in early intervention centres, which is designed for children 3 to 6 years of age. And these centres that I visited had a real focus on upskilling the parents and upskilling the teachers, rather knowing that they're the most present people in their lives and the most important people in their lives, rather than this idea as the therapist stepping in for an hour a week as the expert. So that model really challenged my thinking around how disability services can work. Overall too, there were a lot of really great examples of whole school approaches around response to intervention, particularly when we're thinking of reading and behaviour. The key messages that stood out time and time again from the settings that I visited was that we need to work with a flexible mindset, think creatively, think flexibly, and continue to create and grow opportunities to move more towards inclusion. We know that attitudes towards inclusion are really important, so teacher attitudes and leadership attitudes will determine whether a placement is successful for a student or not, or whether the new policies and programs are successful or not. Something that that this leadership identified as critical for this programs to work was having a high level of staff training and adequate resourcing for them to run. They knew that involving families as much as they could would lead to more support overall for the student and better outcomes. And a lot of what I saw over there really did affirm our current directions and actions within the department as well. Some of the things that schools identified as difficult is translating the medical and the clinical perspectives back into something that's educationally meaningful when they're creating goals and plans for their students. They noted that there is a lack of research on how to realise inclusive education. So there's quite a bit out there that tells us that inclusion in education is a positive thing, that there's lots of benefits, that it's successful, but the research now needs to extend a bit further around how it looks and what are the practices that can happen in schools that will support that. Thinking all of this in respect to our system in South Australia, it did affirm a lot of our practices. I think we're certainly heading in the right direction when I think of the changes around the IESP and the One plans, and also some of the response to intervention style supports that's happening in school. This is all moving towards inclusion, and at a broader level, when I think of the NDIS support for community support, that's really great too. For me, I'll be continuing to share the lessons that I've learned throughout the fellowship within my role and within my networks, and part of that includes disseminating the report that I've put together, which really goes through the whole experience in a lot more detail. That's available online through the Churchill Fellowship website, or you can flick me an email and I can send that through as well. The report outlines a number of recommendations based on the fellowship. The key ones really at a systems level is just continuing to develop and evaluate policy towards inclusion. I've made the suggestion to look at examples of some of the schools that are doing this really well already. So in my region, we have a few area schools that are supporting some students with really high needs, and they're doing an incredible job of it. And I think there's a lot we can learn from them as well. At a grassroots level, what I'm encouraging is that every educator continues to think really flexibly and actively create opportunities for more engagement with our students with disability and students without disability, and keep creating opportunities to move more towards inclusion. I'm always open for a chat on this topic, so please feel free to get in touch if you have any more questions. Otherwise, have a read of the fellowship report, and I hope you might find something in there that's useful for you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Kendra, for that information about what's happening internationally in your research around inclusion. Be good to have a look at some schools in South Australia and what they're doing, and one of them is Parafield Gardens High School. I'd like to introduce India, the Deputy Principal, who's been leading an inclusion journey at that school.
Thank you, Ian. I'm really excited to share some of our journey with our inclusive practices at Parafield Gardens High School. So it began for us approximately 2 years ago, when we were invited to join the Inclusive Schools Community of Practice run by Purple Orange. And what we found through that process, we were able to do a pretty deep analysis as a school on what our barriers were to our inclusive practices and inclusion as a philosophy within our school. And I think it actually takes a lot of courage and bravery for a school to really identify what the barriers are to inclusion. So we worked through that process with our leadership team and with the support of the Inclusive Schools community, which is made up of schools from each sector, and a very, very common approach to we want our schools to be inclusive places, we want to have a shared philosophy, we want to have a shared vision, and how can we work together to make this practical, to give our teachers and our staff practical strategies, and how can we bring our community and our students on board. So as a site, it was really important for us to identify those barriers and then put the practical strategies in place. So what we created was a 4-step process to address some of those barriers. So what could we do to strengthen our Wave 1 practice so we could avoid students unnecessarily moving to a Wave 2 or Wave 3 intervention? So it's really about strengthening the teacher practice, building a shared understanding, and ensuring our students also have a very, very common language and a clear sense of what inclusion is. So we have a student inclusion committee who are looking at how inclusive the school is through their perspective, and they're putting together a plan to share with other students about how we can take the next steps as a site. We've been working very hard with our staff on the foundations, and that can be quite confronting, going back and looking at some of our foundational practice. So for example, we looked at curriculum mapping, and during that time we really delved into universal design principles and how we could incorporate that into our existing structures. We looked at know, understand, do tables and how they can actually help the classrooms become more inclusive places. We also did a lot of work with our parent community. We talked to them about what inclusion was and how inclusive they thought our school was. So we surveyed them, we had conversations with them, we had them come in and give us input on whether we were jumping to an out-of-class strategy too soon, because our focus was on all of our students being in the classroom and learning with their peers. So we believe inclusion really is the lens through which most of our improvement work can happen, if not all of our improvement work. So we try and look at everything that we do, whether it's literacy improvement, numeracy improvement, sense of belonging, it all happens through inclusion. We must have a really strong focus on what's happening at the Wave 1 level in the classroom to ensure that all students feel that sense of belonging in our school. What we've learned as a site is leading for inclusion is difficult and challenging work, because it's about building a shared understanding and building that philosophy. And you really need to have all of the site on board, and not just your teachers and not just your leaders, but your students, your parents, your families, your communities, and all of the agencies you work with. So it really needs a common understanding, a common language, and a common approach. So as far as what we've learnt, we could probably have spent more time building the shared understanding and building the language. So we were all moving together as a site at the same point, at the same time. Obviously, there's always people that are ready to stream ahead and really embrace a change process, but it's very, very important that everybody's moving together at the same pace. So what we've learnt through this process so far, and I feel that we're really only beginning on our journey, even though we have put in several years of work, it's very important to have the whole site on board, and not just your teachers and your staff, but also your students, your parents and families, and the community, so that there's a common understanding of where the school's going and a common language to use so you can measure your improvement. For us as a site, it's been very important to consult with our students, so they're supporting us in this process, and we can have those check-ins with them about, are we on the right track? All of this work is happening for them and with them, so we want to make sure their voice is front and centre in all the conversations we have about improving our school.
As part of our work in South Australia of building a high-performing system and our focus on continuous improvement, two significant reforms have been taking place. One, the One Plan, and the second, the Inclusive Education Support Program. Both are based on the principles of inclusion. Kerry Parker, the Assistant Director in Disability Policy Programs, will be able to give us comment on the progress of each of these initiatives.
Thanks, Ian. The One Plan's been rolling out for about the last three and a half years, and we're looking at bringing together the NEP, the IEP and the ILP, which were for children with disability, children who are in care, and also children, Aboriginal children, our Aboriginal learners. And we've gradually rolled it out to a number of partnerships. In the first year it was 14, 25, and then this year is the rest. Schools and preschools have taken this on with great enthusiasm and passion, understanding the importance of having quality plans for children. From here, we're looking at ensuring at the end of this year that all the schools and preschools have had some information sessions, maybe had some sessions around aims and goals, and also some quality coaching as well. We recently had feedback from our schools and preschools about the online module and how it needed some adjustments, and so we recently had some enhancements which have improved the module, but we understand that it still isn't quite as what people would like. So in the next year or two we're looking at reforming and restructuring the One Plan so that it will be more intuitive and link stronger with a couple of other programs that we have running, which is the Nationally Consistent Collection of Data and the IESP, which is the Inclusive Education Support Program. We have moved from a medical model, a diagnosis model of funding for children, so to a more social model where children depending on their level of need, requiring the adjustments to the curriculum, to the pedagogy, and to their assessment and the environment. So depending on the adjustments required, the resourcing level is dependent on that. So moving from that medical model to the social model has been quite a change, and it fits under the umbrella of personalised learning and our inclusive story. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. This opening address, we've looked at the principles of inclusion, examined some of the practices overseas and in South Australia, and heard about two significant reforms to support inclusion, the One Plan and the IESP. There are 25 other presentations, and each will provide additional information in a range of ways. I'm hoping that will aid everyone's understanding of inclusion and how to build towards it. So thank you, and on to the other presentations.